Babylon, June 323 BC. The heat is suffocating. In the center of the world's most magnificent palace, a man lies dying. He is only 32 years old. His eyes, one brown and one blue, are clouded with fever. Around his bed stand his generals, the men who followed him across 10,000 miles of dust and blood. They are looking at him, not as a king, but as a miracle that is finally fading. They ask him the question that will set the world on fire. To whom do you leave your empire? The dying king gathers his final breath and whispers a single devastating word, Kratisto, to the strongest. In just 12 years, this man did the impossible. He crossed the edge of the known world, destroyed the greatest empire on earth, and built a legacy that still breathes in every city that bears his name. He wanted to be more than a king. He wanted to be a myth. He wanted to be the new Achilles. But behind the golden armor was a man haunted by the shadows of his father and the whispers of his mother. This is Alexander the Great, the man who owned the world, but lost himself in the process. Part 1. The Lion and the Serpent. To understand the conqueror, we must look at the storm that created him. Alexander was born into a house of blood and ambition. His father, Philip II, was a warlord of iron. He took a broken Macedonia and turned it into the most feared military machine in Greece. He was the son that Alexander grew up under, massive, powerful, and blinding. But if Philip gave Alexander his iron, his mother, Olympias, gave him his fire. She was a mystic, a follower of dark cults who reportedly slept with snakes in her bed. She whispered a secret into Alexander's ear that would define his entire life. Philip is not your true father. You were conceived in a bolt of lightning. You are the son of Zeus. You are a god among men. This was the dual nature of Alexander. He was a prince of the earth, but a son of the stars. He spent his entire childhood trying to prove he was worthy of both. When he was 12, a wild, untamable horse named Bucephalus was brought to the court. The king's best riders were thrown into the dirt. Philip called it a waste of time. But young Alexander noticed something everyone else missed. The horse wasn't angry. It was afraid. It was afraid of its own shadow. Alexander turned the horse toward the sun, hiding its shadow from its sight. He didn't use a whip. He used his mind. In that moment, as he rode the black beast across the plains, his father looked at him with a mix of pride and terror and said, "My son, find another kingdom for yourself. Macedonia is too small for you." But Alexander needed more than a sword. He needed a map of the soul. Philip hired the greatest mind in history to tutor him, Aristotle. Under the shade of olive trees, the boy who would destroy empires learned about the nature of the stars, the biology of animals, and the philosophy of power. Aristotle taught him that the world was a puzzle to be solved. He gave Alexander a copy of the Iliad, the story of Achilles. Alexander slept with that book and a dagger under his pillow every night for the rest of his life. He wasn't just reading a story, he was reading his own destiny. Then the lightning struck. In 336 BC, at a wedding festival, Philip II was assassinated by one of his own guards. In a single heartbeat, the sun was gone. The boy prince was now a 20-year-old king, surrounded by enemies who thought he was a weakling. They were wrong. Alexander didn't mourn. He acted. He executed his rivals, crushed the rebellions in Greece, and stood at the edge of the Hellespont, looking toward Asia. He wasn't just a king of Macedonia anymore. He was a storm moving east, and the world was about to find out exactly what happens when you tell a boy he is a god. Part 2. The Gordian Knot and the Fire of Asia. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander did what his father had only dreamed of. He crossed the threshold of the known world. As his ship touched the golden sands of Asia Minor, Alexander didn't just step onto the shore. He took a spear and hurled it with all his might into the earth. It was a declaration of war against an empire that had stood for 2 centuries. He called it land won by the spear. But before he fought a single Persian soldier, he made a detour that revealed the true heart of his mission. He went to Troy. He visited the tomb of his idol, Achilles. He traded his own shield for a sacred one, said to have belonged to the legendary hero. In Alexander's mind, he wasn't just invading a country. He was restarting an epic poem. He was the new Achilles, and Asia was his Troy. But the Persians were not a myth. They were the greatest military force on the planet. As he marched deeper into the heart of Asia, Alexander arrived at the city of Gordian. There, he encountered a puzzle that had defeated every king and genius for centuries: the Gordian knot. The prophecy was simple. Whoever could untie this ancient, tangled mass of rope would become the master of all Asia. For hours, men had watched as others fumbled with the hidden ends, failing to find a beginning or an end to the chaos. Alexander didn't have time for puzzles. He didn't believe in the rules set by other men. In one swift, violent motion, he drew his sword and sliced the knot in half. The message was clear to everyone watching. Alexander wouldn't solve problems by following the past. He would solve them by destroying it. He didn't untie the world. He cut it to his own shape. And from that moment on, the path to the throne of Asia was open. At a place called Issus, the theoretical war became a bloody reality. For the first time, Alexander stood face to face with the great king of Persia, Darius III. Darius was a man of immense dignity, surrounded by his immortals, 10,000 elite soldiers whose ranks never thinned. His army was so vast it looked like a carpet of gold stretched across the horizon. But Alexander saw a flaw. Darius had chosen a narrow battlefield, where his massive numbers were his own cage. Alexander didn't wait. He led the charge himself, riding Bucephalus at the head of his elite companion cavalry. He didn't aim for the Persian lines. He aimed for the heart. He aimed for Darius. The fight was a symphony of chaos, the clash of bronze, the screams of horses, and the suffocating dust of the Mediterranean shore. Alexander fought like a man possessed, his eyes locked on the royal chariot of the great king. When Darius saw the young Macedonian king cutting through his finest guards, he did the unthinkable. He fled. He left behind his army, his treasure, and even his own mother and wife. In that moment, the aura of Persian invincibility shattered. The great king had run away from a boy. Alexander didn't just win a battle. He won a psychological war. He treated Darius's family with the respect of a king, but in his mind, he had already taken the crown. After Issus, the world expected Alexander to chase Darius into the heart of Persia. Instead, he turned south toward Egypt. He wanted more than land. He wanted validation. He marched across the burning sands to the Siwa oasis, to the temple of Amun. There, in the absolute silence of the desert, a priest addressed him with words that would change Alexander forever. He didn't call him king, he called him son of God. Whether it was a translation error or a deliberate move, Alexander embraced it. In the eyes of the Egyptians, he was now a pharaoh. In his own eyes, he was becoming something more than human. The Macedonian boy who slept with a dagger was gone. In his place was a man who believed he was destined to rule the stars. But the deeper he marched into Asia, the more the man began to disappear behind the mask of the god. The fire of Asia was burning bright, but it was starting to consume the very men who had lit it. The final showdown was coming, a battle that would decide the fate of the earth. But as the cities began to burn, Alexander's own men began to wonder, were they fighting for Macedonia or for a man who had forgotten where he came from? Part 3. The End of the World. October 331 BC, the plain of Gaugamela. This was the moment history had been waiting for. Darius III had chosen this ground perfectly. It was flat, wide, and cleared of every rock. A massive stage for his scythed chariots to tear through the Macedonian lines. He had brought 1,000,000 men, a force so large that its campfires looked like a second galaxy on the horizon. Alexander's generals were terrified. They begged him to attack at night, to use the cover of darkness. Alexander looked at them with a cold, quiet confidence and said, "I will not steal my victory." He slept like a child that night, while the world held its breath. At Gaugamela, Alexander didn't just win a battle, he ended an era. Through a gap in the Persian line, he led his cavalry like a thunderbolt, flying straight for the great king. When Darius saw the boy god coming through the dust again, he broke. He fled for the last time. The Persian Empire, the greatest power the world had ever known, collapsed in a single afternoon. Alexander was no longer a king. He was the Shahanshah, the king of kings. Every conqueror has a moment where they lose their way. For Alexander, it was Persepolis. The capital of the world was at his feet. But during a night of heavy drinking and madness, a torch was lit. Whether it was revenge for the burning of Athens years ago, or a drunken accident, the heart of Persia was turned to ash. As the golden roofs melted and the ancient libraries burned, Alexander watched the flames. He was standing at the summit of the world, but the air was getting thin. He began to dress in Persian silks. He demanded that his men bow before him, the proskynesis. To the Macedonians, this was blasphemy. They had followed a king. They were now being ruled by a god who looked more and more like the enemy they had come to destroy. Darius was dead, murdered by his own men. But Alexander couldn't stop. The fire inside him was no longer about Persia. It was about the horizon. He wanted to see where the world ended. He pushed his army into the unknown. They crossed the Hindu Kush in the dead of winter, climbing peaks where the air was too cold to breathe. They fought in the sweltering jungles of the east, facing enemies they had only heard of in legends. In India, at the Battle of the Hydaspes, Alexander met King Porus and his wall of elephants. It was a nightmare of blood and rain. The Macedonians, who had fought every kind of man, were now fighting monsters. They won, but the victory tasted like iron. They were tired. They had been away from home for 8 years. They had marched 11,000 miles. At the Hyphasis River, the storm finally broke. Not from the sky, but from within. Alexander wanted to cross the river. He wanted to reach the great ocean that he believed surrounded the world. But his men did something they had never done before. They said no. They stood in the pouring rain and wept. begging their king to let them see their wives and children before they died. Alexander, the man who had never been defeated by an army, was defeated by the tears of his own men. He retreated into his tent and stayed in total silence for 3 days. When he finally emerged, he agreed to turn back. But the joy of the army was short-lived. The return journey through the Gedrosian desert would be a death march. He would lose more men to the sun and thirst than he ever did to the Persians. It was his punishment for their betrayal. In Babel, the final blow came, not from a spear, but from a fever. Hephaestion, the man who was Alexander's Patroclus, his other half, died. Alexander's grief was pathological. He executed the doctor. He banned all music in the empire. He sat by the body for days, refusing to eat. He was a god among men, but he was realizing that a god who loves a mortal is destined for a broken heart. He was alone, truly, utterly alone. The world was his, but the boy who tamed Bucephalus was dead. In his place was a haunted king, waiting for a fever that would finally take him to the only place he hadn't conquered, the grave. He died at 32. He left no heir, only a command, to the strongest. But as his empire burned, his name became immortal.